visitor here to Proctor Gamble this afternoon. Doug Engelbart, who is sitting next to me here, is a man of extreme eminence in the world of information technology, as you all know. He worked on things 30, 40 years ago that today would be considered visionary, and we're very, very fortunate to have Doug join us. He's been working with people in the company today. Tonight we fly to IBM. He'll be working with our team at IBM tomorrow and then talking with some of their upstream computer scientists in IBM at their research labs tomorrow afternoon. His daughter Christina is here with Doug. Could you stand up, Christina? So even before we begin, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Doug and Christina. I think you all know that among Doug's major inventions, going way back in the 1960s, was in fact the invention of the mouse, the multi-window user interface, the hypertext language, things that today we could not have in the information age without the sense of vision and the sense of how to use technology to augment the human mind, which was Doug's original concept, and it has been a driving force vision in his mind over the last 40 or more years. Doug and I were fortunate enough to meet at dinner about 3 weeks ago in Silicon Valley, a dinner that Bob Johansen organized through the Institute for the Future, and based on that dinner, where Christina was also present, I decided to invite Doug to Procter & Gamble to take a look at what we were doing and also let him share with us, and particularly all of you, his thoughts and ideas of what's been happening in the world of information technology in the past as well as into the future. He is truly a man of tremendous future vision. And to give you an example of that, before we get started here this afternoon, I would like, if you could, Bob Coons, to set up a video of Doug Engelbart in 1968, I believe, experimenting and demonstrating his very first mouse. And right after this, we'll get started with giving Doug a chance to talk to us, and I'll be asking some questions, and we will encourage all of your participation. So, Doug, here you are, back 30 years ago, and you probably, I don't know when the last time is you saw this, so here, let's take a look.
This was at a computer conference in San Francisco, in front of an audience of about over 1,000 people.
Okay, to talk about control devices, we'll use this overhead camera shot, where you can see the devices that I'm using. I use 3, and they're not all standard. We have a pointing device called a mouse, a standard keyboard, and a special key set we have here. And we're going to go for a picture down in our laboratory in Menlo Park and pipe it up. That'll show you from another point of view more about how that mouse works. Come in, Menlo Park. Okay, there's Don Andrews' hand in Menlo Park. And in a second we'll see the screen that he's working and the way the tracking spot moves in conjunction with movements of that mouse. I don't know why we call it a mouse. Sometimes I apologize. It started that way and we never did change it. All right, as it moves up or down or sideways, so does the tracking spot. And the principles for its operation are quite easy to see. If you'll turn it over, Don. Can you hear me, Don? Would you turn it over and we'll see, right? Its principle is that there are 2 wheels that roll on the surface. But since they're right angles and kind of sharp edges, one roll and the other slide in one direction. Each of these wheels controls through a potentiometer with a voltage output sampled by an 80D converter the numbers taken in by the computer at sample times as to what the horizontal vertical components are to be of where it should put the tracking spot. And as the mouse moves over a surface, then each of those wheels either slides sideways without rolling or rolls an amount that very closely duplicates the particular component of horizontal or vertical in the net motion it makes. All right, if you take a mouse and move it through some closed trajectory back to exactly the same point, usually the tracking spot won't come back to exactly the same place it was on the screen. And for that sense, it wouldn't work well if you're trying to trace maps or other figures and diagrams. But the way we use it continuously and exclusively is to watch the screen and to follow it around, and we use this merely as a device to move that tracking spot, and you're eyeing the tracking spot, you really don't care whether it follows exactly this or not. In fact, we've had it at times where our tracking device, you had to move in an arc like that to make the tracking spot go on a horizontal line. And people adjusted to it and would go like that to go in a straight line and wouldn't even know that they were doing it. Other features of the mouse are that it stays put. I can lift it and replace it without having the spot change, so I can adjust where I want it for my comfort. And these control buttons on the top are used quite a bit, and I'll show you a little bit later how some of those are used.
Well, that's it. 30 years ago, this was the man who was inventing the mouse that we use today. It's still a mouse. No one's changed the name. I think, I don't know, Logitech, the company that now houses Doug's Bootstrap Foundation, I think sells 40 million or some odd of these things. But anyway, Doug, I think to get this started, I might like to ask a question and ask you to recall what was going on in your life, and at the time you originally had this vision of using computers, which back then did not really even exist, with the notion of using them to augment the human mind and to deal with the increasing complexities that you saw happening in the world.
Well, the triggering action was getting engaged. And the next Monday, driving to work, and one thing I have to background is I grew up in the Depression, which leaves a lasting impact. And so lots of times you grow up in a Depression, and getting a steady job was a big thing, because a lot of your neighbors didn't have steady jobs or something like that. So I had a steady job. I was working as an electrical engineer for what's now NASA. And another thing is you're going to get married and live happily ever after. So I was engaged, and of course now that business part of it was okay. So driving to work, it suddenly got to thinking of, oh, what are my goals, you know, career-wise, professionally? And it was the funniest experience to just suddenly realize, other than having an interesting job and a steady one, I didn't have any. And which, you know, shows to some extent kind of what a backwards country kid I was. But so I thought, well, why don't I start setting up what could goals be? And for some reason, I sort of realized earning a lot of money would be nice, but gee, you could probably do quite a few things that would be contributory or interesting and also earn enough money. So I set that aside. And it wasn't very long till I tried on in my head, well, what if you try to maximize the contribution your career would make to society? I have no idea where that comes from. And sometimes I almost curse it, because that locked me in for some reason to really thinking about that. And it started thinking about, well, I'm an engineer, and who needs more engineering? So what are the things the world really needs? And gee, that needs a more stable economy, it needs better education, it needs a bunch of things like that. Oh, and I should go try to make a crusade to do something singular in those fields. Well, any of that would cause, I'd probably have to go get refurbished as an economist or an educator or something. And I was 25, and do I want to go back and line up with the 18-year-olds? So I kept thinking about crusades of all kinds, and after 2.5 months of that, I think it was, one Saturday morning, it suddenly dawned on me that crusades are very hard to design, because the world's complex enough so you can't really be sure that you design a solution that when it gets implemented isn't going to have side effects that are as bad as you were trying to cure. And one example being, oh, I guess I'll go in and clean up the swamps in this country because there's so much yellow fever, it's really hard on all the natives. So you do that, and so in another generation their population has grown so much that that's what's ruining that environment. So he says, well, geez. So one Saturday morning it just dawned on me, it's very complex and getting more so, and most of the complex challenges to society have to be dealt with collectively, and our collective ability to deal with complex, urgent issues and problems isn't increasing nearly as fast as the complexity and urgency are. So this was 1951. And so I was an electrical engineer, and I'd been sort of, interestingly enough, I'd been a radar technician in the Navy during World War II, and so I knew how radar screens could draw pictures and how simple digital stuff in there could handle things. And so I'd read about computers, so I knew that anything, if a computer can punch cards or print paper, they could draw anything you want on a screen. And I also knew, because of that radar, that you can sample what the operator's doing so they could keep track of what you're doing and you could interact with the computer. And now that would let you use all kinds of new symbology on the cathode ray tube screen, and colleagues of yours could sit around tied to the same complex and you could collaborate, and it'd be a totally new, different way to try to connect your brain. So that's, I mean, it's embarrassing to say that that's the kind of thing I just tied my life to. So my young fiancée was looking forward to settling down. She'd grown up as an Army brat, and she and all her relatives were so pleased that she was going to get to settle down with a guy that had a steady job. And oh dear, I've gotten accepted to graduate school at Berkeley because they're building a computer there. And so that, being off on that now, it's been every year since then, pursuing that. And there are a lot of stages it could tell you about as its evolution, including the last years when Christina, one of my daughters, has teamed up with me to form an institute that's really trying to sell the world on a real strategic approach to try to do this. You know, if I kept talking long enough, he couldn't ask me any more questions.
We might come back to Bootstrap a little bit later. What has impressed you about the evolution of information technology over the years? For example, the evolution of personal computers, or the development of the Microsoft Corporation, or the explosion of today's internet. What are the most impressive things to you as you look back over the last 3 decades?
Well, this may surprise you, but it's how slow it's moving. And how hard it is to get people to look ahead far enough. And so, to me, that's in times of such explosive change as this, the paradigms that are really guiding, settling the world's way of looking at things have to shift in concordance with that. They have to get farther ahead. And that just hasn't been happening. And so that was a surprise to me, but it's also a very valuable lesson.
So, in terms of things that might be frustrating to you, having been a bit ahead of most of the rest of us, it would be in the area of speed with which things have occurred, or the lack of a continuing forward-going vision, like what's the next big evolution of technology?
Well, the frustration was basically that there wasn't any place for me to connect in. We had really a flowering laboratory in the 60s and 70s, and most of the things I get lauded for were generated during that period. We were supported by ARPA and some with other government agencies, but we were just really trying to build and use and evolve what could really make a difference. But then we ran across the people's perception began to be so much different about, you know, automate your offices, etc. on the one hand, so you're just automating. And on the other hand, it was the artificial intelligence people saying, we're going to make such smart computers that they'll sit there and they'll make a model of the user, and they'll find out what the user can do and knows and needs, and then they'll match to that, and the user won't have to learn anything. And they really, between the two of them, I just got sent to, you know, we lost all our support and had to go in the commercial world. And that was a very good eye-opener. We had a system that was sturdy enough to be selling services. And a history that goes back to the time when ARPA, the government agency, decided it was going to experiment with computer networking. And they were told us, to 13 of us principal investigators supported by ARPA in the computer and interactive computing field. And each of us had a time-sharing computer that was experimenting. So they told us that in order to experiment with a network, they were going to tie us together. And this horrified everybody else, and it just thrilled me because I needed a community to support, to interact, and do this stuff. So I volunteered to start and run a networked information center for that. And for that purpose, they made me the second computer tied to the network. So, and all your internets, I've been on it since day one, since the first packets got sent back and forth. But 7 or 8 years later, we got shut down because we were judged to be going in the wrong direction. So ever since then, it's been trying almost from the outside, not being part of real organizations and enough to sort of steer things, trying to sell and tell, and just so many fruitless almost sales to every one of the big companies, DEC and Hewlett-Packard and IBM. We've knocked on the doors. We almost had a real pilot going at McDonnell Douglas. Anyway, we had things that could do a lot of the stuff you're showing without nearly the color and the glamour, but much more. The hypermedia system was much more detailed. You could make a link that cited any object in a document, and you could actually use that link in an instruction if you wanted to as an address to go copy that word to here or something. So you had all kinds of viewing options when you looked at a document that helped a great deal doing stuff. You had explicit hierarchical structure you could apply to it that would help you move around, get views, etc. We had a way to put in documents that were unchangeable, just like you're publishing, and linking it in reference from any place. We had multiple computers being able to interlink between each other. And it was a client-server thing. We had, anyway, just on and on, because it was evolving with everybody used it. We used it for our software, and the system was still runnable now. We can show it. 500,000 lines of code, and every one of those is in a hyperstructure that you can link to and talk about. Just on and on, very different. And yet, showing it, describing it, saying what the future could be, you just couldn't find anybody that could hear it. And if DEC and Hewlett-Packard and IBM aren't doing it, we can't do it. So anyway, it's very exciting now to see it begin exploding. So what I had to do during those years was think about the strategy of, if it's really an extremely complex set of changes going to happen in a rate that we've never had to cope with before, then you need a strategy for how any big organization should start doing its evolution. And we can talk about more of that later. Geez, I could, on second thought, I'll keep talking because then you'll...
No,
it's your turn.
That's why we wanted to have you come and talk with us. If we were 30 years from today into the future, what do you think we would see that would be surprising and different to us than what we see today?
Well, let's start out with what I believe the technology would evolve towards. There's a brand of it that I buy completely that's called Nanotechnology, and it's saying, look, we can make devices by reorienting explicit single molecules together into little packages of multimolecular things that are going to functionally do interesting things. And out of that we can make all kinds of stuff, especially digital. So it's just inevitable, honestly. But so I asked the leaders of that a year ago. I said, well, what can you tell people about, that made it? He says, well, here's one thing. You'd be able to hold in your hand a hunk of something that's got as much digital storage, memory, computing power, etc., as all the computers in the world have today. See, that's a scale change that it's just sort of unthinkable, and you can easily set it aside, but it's just as inevitable as in 1960 or something I was telling people, every knowledge worker is going to be able to work at a cathode ray tube dynamically with a computer. It's inevitable, and that's the kind of thing that got me pushed to Siberia. But anyway, so suppose it's 10 or 20% probable instead of sort of inevitable like that. So what you should do to prepare for it? And I think in 30 years, it's if not holding in your hand everything that's all the power that's in the world today, it's all the power that's in Cincinnati today for sure. The state, whichever state we're in now.
Ohio.
Yeah, Ohio. There's a kid, Christine and I neither have been here before, and we grew up on the West Coast so much that everything the other side of, well, Nevada or something is back east. That's my youth. See. So let's see, Ohio. Isn't that near Iowa? No, that's the other state. but anyway, so, but you know, at least it's just going to. So anyway, somehow thinking about the kind of shifts like that and what it means is going to be very, very important, because in the past it's always been aimed at what the individual user is going to see or do, and what really was for me from the word go is the collective capability of people, how that improves and changes. So in the last years, Christine and I have been talking about the collective IQ of any organization as a very, very real thing. You know, you got a collective group of people, P&G. Well, there's a change in the outside world that's going to affect what it best should do. Maybe it's a threat or an opportunity. Okay, so you look at that as an organism and say, how soon does it marshal the really appropriate understanding of the outside world, make a plan for the adaptation it's going to do, take stock of its resources, reorganize and make a plan for them, and coordinate the resources so it's really marching in a new direction effectively. So how well and rapidly would it do that? So that's sort of a sign of its collective IQ. So anyway, you think of a country. So when you start trying to gauge it or something like that, and you don't come up with very high numbers for the collective IQ you can observe in terms of what would be there if you realize, think about how you could harness all of the latent mental capability of all the people in it. You know, it's tremendous talent, but it's connected very, very ineffectively. So anyway, that's...
Okay.
Do you want to have other kinds of pictures? Go ahead.
If we think about the point you just made, communities of people working together, creating new knowledge, sharing that knowledge, developing insights that lead to actions in the marketplace, how would you see companies that want to be at the leading edge of this whole area of identifying and using their collective IQ, what should they be doing today to do that? We are working hard to try to become more of a learning organization, knowledge creating and sharing. You've seen some demonstrations of some of the tools we're using. But I'd be interested in your thoughts and ideas, because it's right on your whole notion of collective IQ. It also feeds to your idea of A, B, and C, which I might ask that you share with our group here today, of how you take what you're doing, improve it, and then improve the way you improve it. But share with us your thoughts and ideas about what the really smart organizations ought to be doing today to do a better job in this whole area of using communities of interest within the organization to create new knowledge and use it better.
Well, the basic thing is that there isn't anybody that kind of knows the answer about what you really best could aim at becoming or something. It's just more complex, and certainly managing your knowledge is certainly important, and collaboration is certainly important, and but what the configuration is going to be of how you change all the ways you work, etc., there's nobody that knows, and much less knows what the environment of Procter & Gamble is going to be in 10 years. So you have to be able to adapt both to the challenge of changing your internal modes so you get more effective, as well as the challenge of adapting to the rapidly changing world. And so to me the most important thing then comes this issue of how do you set up an infrastructure to guide your improvement and evolution so that that can be sort of as reasonably as effective as possible. And that's, yeah, it's always, you can always give an answer that pushes it off to ask another question because you didn't. Next question, please.
Well, I'd be very interested in when you say build an infrastructure to do this better. What comes to mind when you think about infrastructure in that regard?
Shall we do this?
Sure.
Shall we? So anyway, this collective IQ, we have this presentation that Christine and I have made in the past, and it's based upon a macromedia director show and it's sort of oriented around this kind of a set of boxes, each of which is really a miniature modification to a paradigm. And it turned out in the studies, there was a 2.5-year study I did between 1959 and 1962, that publication in our web. It's got a German history of technology group sent us an email a few months ago and says, well, we found that report and we put it on the web for you. And it's really interesting. So that whole kind of picture there was a very important one. So much of what came across in these changes here was sort of came out in raw form in that one, and then more advances to it. So what I could do is just very quickly show it to you by not just highlighting it like that, but by highlighting it with a center sort of piece of information that tells a little bit about it. But you start out with the objective of high performance organization, and after a while of studying that, you begin to realize you don't just go change a couple of core competencies, that if you're going to have really radical change support systems like the technology, that there's a whole infrastructure of capabilities that makes an organization tick, and you need to really consider all of that, because there are candidates all throughout that infrastructure, candidates that the technology is going to be able to impact and such. So then you says, okay, another thing that was a real breakthrough for a techie guy who I'd been thinking for 10 years then about the tools, was this thing about saying, oh, you're going to augment people and you're thinking of all the tools, but for the radical kind of things coming on, there's a whole set of skills and knowledge and roles and even your language and the way you portray things and everything else like that that are going to impact. And then a realization that what makes your organization capable in the first place is this system that augments you. But it starts out with your, developing a language and such as that, when you're in the cultures that you've gotten enculturated with in the schools, etc., your family, and then the particular professional skills you do, and then the facilities that are put together that are made all this, but all the conventions about how you organize groups, how you lead them, what kind of roles you have in there, how you establish a committee, stuff. There's a huge amount of invention in that. So it's the combined of those two that augments all of us, so our latent natural capabilities are able to connect together and do what we can do. And then saying there's a revolution coming in this tool system, so that's going to take, that in order to accommodate that, there's going to be a comparable, collateral revolution in the human system side, and that just wasn't people's language. So you have to work together, and this led to saying, oh, well, our approach has got to be a pragmatic co-evolution. So I'm extremely pleased, so for the discussions going on in this group today so far that I've heard, is it's right out there. You got human resources, you got all kinds of other stuff talking about how we collaterally co-evolve these things, but that's a big important thing. So then one of the things is to realize what's the scale of change that we need to accommodate. So I've always been operating all this time on this huge scale, everything in the world, that the scale of change and the rapidity of it in the technology of the digital world is just exceeding anything that any society in our world has ever had to cope with before. And it's going to be a global, integrated global effect and change, and very complex and very fast. So the cost to any organization about concurrently evolving with that is going to be much higher, and the rate of change and stuff like that. So then you say, oh, what I need in that, I need to consider the return on investment for my investment in change and improvement, and I'd like to find a strategy that instead of bump, 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 every time like that will give me a compounded return. So isn't that very businesslike of me? I mean,
Very.
Yes, so I knew about compound interest because of banking and the kids, but I don't know much about business really. But anyway, so this says, well, hey, that would really like, so what you want to look for some kind of business-like investment criteria for how you would really best, in a strategic sense, invest in your improvement or evolution. And so, this comes out for centering on an improvement infrastructure, because that's sort of based back here with your capability infrastructure. Well, some sub-part of that is the infrastructure that is employed to do your improvement. And so in the 62 paper or something like that, I was really looking for how do you get that kind of amplification? And it suddenly started occurring to me that, oh, if in this change process I get it so that I can use some of the same new capabilities that I'm bringing up into this capability infrastructure, if I can use it for this, I get bootstrapping out of it. That I'm not only, one measure of being a more effective organization is boosting your product cycle. Well, if not only that, if I can bring in new capabilities, and if I have an appropriate improvement infrastructure, and I plug those new capabilities into there, can I get an improvement cycle speeding and getting better too? So it says, great. So that's what led me into the particular kind of capabilities here that we call the collective IQ. Saying, the very way to frame this and build and work on it and develop the ideas underneath that box are the same kind of things we can put into the improvement structure, etc. And so then it says, okay, you're making headway, you're getting this collective IQ pursuit, etc. And then you need there's one massive kind of requirement based upon this, that if you find these magic things that work for Proctor Gamble, well, you've got to make sure that you can also work with the outside world and not islands. So this interoperability, and we were by that time we got the company that bought us from Stanford Research Institute in the commercial time-sharing business got bought up by McDonnell Douglas, so I could have a chance to go and talk to the heavy industry people about their use of it. And it was really terrific to find out how you could probably augment the whole process by which you develop an airplane design. And not only that, by concurrently how you develop the manufacturing capability to do that. And not only that, by how you develop the community of top-level suppliers who have to co-design things in your aircraft like that. And not only that, by how you can interoperate with the end users, which have a great deal of interaction back and forth as you do the logistics support and the upgrading of models, etc. like that. So this interoperability was great. And then this kind of a picture of, in the end, what's going to be needed out here is a globally interoperable, open, hyper-document system. And we just invented that name in the late 80s. It's just saying, it's inevitable. It's got to be hyper-linked, multimedia, and it has to be an open system. And so the HTML kind of thing in there is just sort of proven that case where you can dive around and get into there. And it doesn't mean it can't be all folded up and tucked away in a database system at all, but conceptually it's still a document when you unfold it for the viewing, etc. and things like that. So there are a lot of things we bored down. If we dig down underneath that box, there are a lot of the things we did in there that are still open for exploration and such that other people haven't done it. But then there's a question of deploying all that, which is a very important thing as you make headway within your organization, how best to deploy it from a strategic point of view. And so that out of that comes one of the important sort of pictures about high-performance teams that are selected and recruited and equipped and trained to be really high-performance knowledge workers on new levels that you can't get by just getting to be good at what the current products can be harnessed and such like that. So there's a need of prototypes like that. Then you need to find ways to deploy them within an organization so they not only can effectively utilize that extra tech capability they have, but that their interaction with that has a way for the other people in the organization to see and rub shoulders and sort of get the feeling for what you can do if you can get trained, etc., to new levels. And this means, in this open hyper-document system, you need a way in which you can have multiple grades of user proficiency with the appropriate interfaces for them and such. So a lot of this strategic stuff comes out, and it's really possible to go after. Then you start talking about, then how can you do that? If you have an improvement infrastructure that's appropriate in your organization, then you can actually hack that structure and move it up a level so that you can get cooperating communities of organizations saying, there's a lot in common that we could collectively work on that would help us improve our improvement process. And it goes on from there. But that's the high-level thing, and we can spend 3 days deeper into it, and but I'm not going to. But there are some really key things, especially up in here and here and here and here and anyway.
Well, I think it would be quite interesting if you might be able to share, by way of example or concept, the A, B, C approach that is in here, but you didn't quite lay it out in that very straightforward fashion with,
Okay.
like we did with Dirk earlier today.
We just
I think the concept here, as Doug teased this up, is any organization is operating its business or its government a certain way today. And probably every organization is trying to improve the way they do that. So the first is A, and the improvement is B. But the thing that I found fascinating and elegantly simple in Doug's thinking is there's C. How do you improve the way you improve and get that ROI curve to be compounded as opposed to incrementally growing? So if you could tell us a little bit more about that, that would be great.
Yeah. So it started with, if you have a human and tool system, you're augmenting your organization, and you're going to want to go through this set of thinking. You start categorizing the activity that you find in the organization. So every day chunking along is all A, and that includes hiring people and training them to do the jobs that are there today, and doing product development the way you do, and selling, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're trying to improve any part of your augmentation system, then you put on a different hat and just give it a different name. Say it's B activity. And it's not an inventing new activity, it's just inventing a label that helps do some thinking in a certain way. So anyway, then the idea that if you're coming into an era of much more rapid, complex change, whereas B has been sort of a semi-casual thing through all the years. You put up a cross-functional committee to do something that's going to improve this or that packaging or something, and they work at it together and do their thing, and it gets changed, or you get a consultant to come in and make a plan and change. But you say, look, B is going to be so much more critical, and we're going to live and die by it as much as we live and die by anything we do in the A world like that. So you said, okay, you want to improve that, then you need to realize that if it's serious work, you got to give it another category. So this A, B, and C emerged, and it really has helped a lot as a basis for that infrastructure. You had some comments?
Well, the thing I find fascinating about this, I think Procter Gamble probably does a pretty good job with A and B, but I'm not so sure we've thought too much about C. C being a catalyst, a synergizer that improves the way you improve. I think any company that can start to systematize that in the way they think about their business and how they're going to improve their business is going to end up with a competitive advantage, because you're immediately thinking about beyond today's improvement, it's how do you improve the way you improve. And I find that very compelling and very powerful, especially for a company with intrinsically a high collective IQ. Procter & Gamble is a company of 106,000 people. We try hard to hire the brightest and best people we can around the world. We try to give them stimulating, challenging jobs and work. If you collect all the IQs of those 106,000 people, it would be a rather awesome chunk of brain power there. But I think most of our brain power, frankly, is in A. I don't know, pick a number, 75%, maybe 29% or whatever. I'll bet 1% of our work is in C. I don't know whether you all would share that perception, but that's the way I feel about it, having worked across a variety of businesses. We're so busy running hard at A that maybe Friday night on the way home to catch a glass of wine or a beer, you might think a little bit about B and forget C. It's not on our horizon. And I think that's a very compelling conceptual framework, and the role that we have as information technology professionals, I think, would be to provide some intellectual leadership on this. You know, if we were to take some part of our business, whether it's R&D or product supply or our own business, what would we be doing if we wanted to move more in this direction intellectually? And maybe take a pilot project or of some kind and really think it through. We are, saying we want to accelerate our ability to innovate. And it's true, we do. Our corporate sales growth is lackadaisical relative to what we'd all like it to be. It's better this year than last year. But I just have a hunch that there's the seed of an idea planted in Doug's concept here that we ought to maybe plant somewhere and try and grow. I have no idea what that means when I say that, but I find this a very intriguing way to think about how we can change the way we do our work so we have a continuous way of always doing it faster and, more importantly, better.
There's some more maturing to this that you might be interested in.
Sure.
If we look, and so we can just, well, one thing about it is the relationships between them. It's like, who's the customer and the supplier? Well, between B and A, you can, and between C and B. So that's something to kind of think about as you're going to organize C. It's trying to help B. And then another thing is that any given person might have a B hat on for 6, 8, 2, 3, 4 hours a week or whatever, or a C hat even. And so it isn't that that's just special teams of people necessarily. You can get them in there, but you have to think of it as activities. So you might be engaged in those various kinds at different times. The idea to get clear. Another thing is most industries kind of already know what percentage of their revenue goes back into product R&D, but you find out that almost none of them knows about the B, much less the C. And so that's what becomes, it's going to be a life-threatening thing. So there's another area in here, if we think about moving around in this, getting collectively smarter and interoperable with an operating and deploying like this, where this thing we talked about of this collective, networked improvement community. So let's just take a look about that as saying, suppose there's Proctor Gamble, and yes, we recognize that, and we want to get better at doing C, etc. Well, there's some of the characteristics about that that are interesting. So we say, oh, down the street, come on, what's the matter here? So there's organization number 2, and we could probably find a number of them that we have some kind of interest in collectively. Should we stay away from our competitors, or do they have to be near us and the same, or what? No, let's just say what we're interested in is sharing the C work, and say, oh, let's consider and somehow making an alliance among ourselves that for a given set of improvement capabilities we're trying to work on inside our A, that means our B's have in common between ourselves, because we're all interested, say, in knowledge management or something like that. And we can share a lot of the work of building up the new C stuff without giving away proprietary stuff up here in the A at all, and the B like that. But they'd be very important. And then the thing then next, the challenge is to say, well, how many things are there that we can do collectively at that C level that pay off, that it sort of multiplies the results that we get. And you just say, well, there's a lot. And we could make it a quiz. Can we give them a quiz? To see if they're awake? That intelligence collection about what's going on in the outside world, for instance, if this is something that they're interested, they just pick knowledge management. We want to improve. Okay, what's going on in the outside world? What are the tools that are being developed? What are the practices that are doing? How do we analyze that? Can we collectively fund some real work at doing scenario development out there so that we get a better feel? Can we collectively invest in some pilot operations to shake things down? There's a lot like that. Can we have some training in there for people? So when I looked at your catalog and the other network things that you guys that were demonstrated for us the time before you all came, this very impressive sort of thing, and you look at it and it says, oh, we need to do that same sort of thing for the kind of knowledge that every bee in here needs in order for this thing. And then what kind of experience can we provide? Because a lot of the implicit knowledge doesn't come just with what you can give them like that. Oh, well, what you need to do is get people that rotate from working in this B area to coming into the C and helping do this work here, And you'd like to invest enough collectively in the C so you're using the most advanced capabilities and tools that you can actually do, and actually piloting some things that are downstream so we all get a learning about it. So there, back up some of the other boxes we get down into, we look at the marketplace and say why it needs an infrastructure like this, and et cetera. But
Okay.
anyway.
I'd like to open this up a little bit, rather than make this a dialogue up here with myself and Doug, to invite you to ask questions or make comments and stimulate other discussion and ideas. So why don't we open this up to anybody who'd like to ask a question? I guess, Patrick, your hand is up first.
I have a clarification question to better understand the A, B, and C. I'm going to give an example of how we work and see if to test it versus the model. When we introduce a new system in a plant, for example, to improve the plant working, MRP system, materials management system, a few years ago it would take us 12 to 18 months to do a plant. Today we are in a system that we can do a plant in 3-4 months. Bringing that 18 to 3-4 months, do you consider that a C activity, or is that B? You understand the question?
Well, that was a B activity. You're actually designing and implementing that improvement and getting it up.
I
But
consider
if
implementing the system, yeah, in 18 months was a B activity to improve the way the people did it.
let's see,
But implementing it faster instead of 8 to 3 months, the C one is what I'm going.
Let me try a translation and have Doug come in. It would seem to me that the original plant activity was an A, 12 to 18 months. The B was getting it down to the lesser number. And I think the point Doug would make, and please speak for yourself, Doug, would be how do you take that and improve that? That would be true C, get it down to 1 month, for example.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I've said an appropriate analog back to your model.
yeah. It comes to that because building the new plant is an A. You know, you're doing it, but unless you're doing that better than you used to do before, then it wasn't a B. But if you got a process for building the new plant that really does it a lot better, well, implementing that was a B process. But finding out how to do it and getting the ideas and stuff would have been C. So if you'd been going to conferences, et cetera, and investing energy in getting the position where you could do that, that would be the C. And so I would, it gets more subtle, and especially gets more subtle when we go on for other stages about this kind of infrastructure, because it's like saying here, we call a networked improvement community a NIC, and you look around and say, well, there are a lot of improvement communities, and if they aren't really networked and try to do it in a modern way, we call them an IC. So the meetings in this Bootstrap Alliance that we got people interested in that, like Sun and Netscape got in early, a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, wasn't it, to say, hey, let's start making this happen. And this encouraged us, and we got more people on it. And successive set of quarterly meetings is getting more and more dynamics going on. So this concept has evolved in the point of that. And one of the evolutions then I can just show you is in this other sense of here. But it's Curtis saying, okay, here's the NIC idea. See, and when in other parts of our presentation there, we go on and say any organization is going to have a knowledge repository. If it's going to do this collective IQ stuff, it just means that you've got to make shareable knowledge that's available to all the parts of the organism in there like that. And then, 16, 17 years ago, the idea was oriented about, there's several discernible parts to that, and one is the intelligence collection of what you have brought in from the outside world, and the other then is you're recording a lot of the dialogue that was on the different ideas and the arguments and all the email and stuff as that. And then, but at one point, which in some sense the catalog part that was shown here earlier, or others is the knowledge product. What is it today that you can bomb into to find out the situation that we understand? What's the applicable knowledge that's available today in here? And it can't just be all of the undigested stuff you find here. So you have to find a digestion integration process. And remember that Kodiak idea was developing, integrating, and applying. So the applicable knowledge here has to be in a form that's accessible to reach as really useful knowledge. And in a sense, it's like an electronic handbook about how you can do your work. And in this case, because of this is a NIC, it'd be an electronic handbook of how the bees can better do their work. Well, they're going to be busy investing in building the same kind of things for their respective A groups. So it's a very interesting way in which the propagation can go and all of that. So then we got to thinking about, well, that's going to be very important. Oh, well then what about this? This was the shift that occurred then a year or so ago, is saying, oh, then the alliance we want to make that really would benefit is we want to make a NIC of NICs, you know, an alliance of NICs, so that the role of this one is how do you get your NIC to be better and better? And so you can have NICs that are pursuing all kinds of things, and this provides sort of a kind of a meta-level improvement infrastructure that the more you think about it, the more potency it has. It's like saying, well, you guys could go in and you have one particular kind of processing interest maybe. I'm staying away from knowledge management because it's so universal. But say there's a certain kind of processing capability or chemical processing or manufacturing that you know could be improved, or the quality movement was an example, that you can find other organizations who could share the C-level stuff about that, collectively going after it, because you all need to know you have to get better, and so getting the basic capabilities of how you do your improvement can be paid. So we're finding quite a few examples of that out there like that. So then you say, okay, if you formed a NIC like that and became part of the alliance, then collectively you invest time and energy in here too to do things that you're going to have to do anyway. So this is the current picture, and we've got some very interesting sort of emergent NICs lined up to come to bat, et cetera, with this. So this is the kind of way it's going, where you can even think about a national improvement infrastructure like based on this, or anyway, so that if getting into some kind of NIC would be a payoff to Proctor Gamble, which I think in the end you'd get in there, you'd probably find quite a few special interest NICs that would be very relevant for you to participate in. And so
Okay, very interesting. Ted?
I'd be interested in hearing more about the 30 years from now applications of that power that you talked about in your hand. What kind of applications would you see? You know, like computer surgery, you know, with no incision, or you know, if it finds the right spot to internally. What do you see?
Oh, is this a lot? You can chug your imagination all over, but you'll know that'll make so much bandwidth available in any kind of wireless form that you carry around with you all you need, and it might even be surgically implanted so that it gets the energy it needs from your metabolism. And then while it's at it, it can sort of keep a check on your white counts, what's going on, and everything like that, and really do a lot of monitoring and actually therapeutic, you know, biochemical therapy and there like that. Then you says, okay, can it intercept signals in a lot of my nerve channels? Well, yeah. Well, could that help me amplify my sensory capability? Probably. And so you can just really go into things like that, where you could just start to become sort of a bionically amplified person. And some of this is really kind of horrifying or revolting, but it's apparent.
Sounds like fun to me.
So then another one is sort of saying, like, why would you ever have to go someplace? Because you know, you can get the same sensations provided to you as being any place, etc. So why would you move around? And so, to be very efficient, because the population has grown so much that you've got, space-wise, you've got about 6.5 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet, and that's your space in the world, and you never have to leave it because you can be connected out there, see? and you can be fed intravenously, of course, etc. So this is the very hyper-efficient world that some people could picture, and it makes me sick. See, whereas, you know, we could also go about saying, look, by that time we could be collectively smart enough so we could understand social and political dynamics enough to get some kind of stability in there and kind of really understand where empathy and bonding and all of that come from, so we could actually design and implement and maintain a rational sort of human-centered Earth that could be really terrific. And before that comes, with either of those options, there are likely to be, you know, traumatic dislocations that occur because, you know, globally we're not smart enough to cope with a lot of the changes. Look at the Asian financial crisis catching us by surprise. Why the hell did it surprise us? See, we weren't smart enough. Or are we managing it now, or what's next? And so it just seems to me with horrendously compelling something or other that if there's really something to this potential of boosting your collective IQ, getting after that as early as we can to forestall some of the calamities, which could end up, you know, a crisis happen, which the whole financial thing collapsed. And if you think through what would happen if the global financial structure collapsed one afternoon, what would happen? See, well, is there any imaginable process that could get it going again? Not that I know of. Well, if you had to start all the way up with barter and everything else like that, billions of people would die within weeks. And we put back in the feudal age, because, you know, you'd have to group together with armed combat in order to protect your turf and try to go steal the food that you'd need to keep your group alive or something. And, you know, just horrible scenes about what could happen. So the thing that keeps me going, tottering along years after sensibly one would retire, is every year sooner that the world takes seriously the potential for going after this boosted IQ, the boosted ability to deal collectively, gives us a better chance for survival. And that's what keeps me going. And so it also happens to give me this slightly zealous approach now, grabbing by the throat and says, listen, but it's to me it's deadly real. And the potential is really, really there and very exciting. But how do you wake up the world to just go after it as a really, really something special? Not just that we're going to get 10% better next year, but that, hey, we're going to start taking steps that we can climb the hill and get better at it. And which pulpit do you listen to on Sundays?
Other questions? Yeah.
To put together these NICs and to start working on them to sort of create this knowledge product, you need to work together. You sort of mentioned on the slide here around collaborative websites. What do you see over the next 5-10 years? What from a collaborative tool standpoint, how do you see that working? What should we be looking at as we think about how to help our people collaborate better?
Well, if I'm going to live up to what I've been doing, I'll have to make an indirect approach to that. And the way I'll do it is go back up to another sort of potential here. First, I want to show you sort of what this picture is. This emerged about 1961, and you know, technology guy thinking, oh boy, we're going to do all these things. And slowly I began to be aware of things over on this side. And so finally I started listing them. And that just sobered me up so much that, if anything, I've been more leaning on that side, even though I get applauded for the things in here. I keep saying, hey, look, the only way that's going to get harnessed is by changes in here. So that's really, really, I can't emphasize it enough in any image about the changes of that, stuff like that. So you have to think of the cooperative changes with that thing in there like that. So this led to looking at a picture like this, of saying, oh, I've got, you know, my tools, technology is changing and improving in this direction, And it's just exploded that normally, relative to where organizations are today in harnessing technology with whatever human system sort of thing they do, they would all be used to living in this first quadrant down there, that the technology is only moving, advancing that far ahead of what we already use. But suddenly it's spurting out here like that, where there are capabilities that you know could be built that wouldn't know how to really integrate into an organization, see? And we can go to examples of that, but it's just really the case. So this thing of saying that that's where you can look at the current marketplace and realize, hey, the vendors aren't responsible for telling you much about what's out there. They're responsible to their, their stockholders for capturing the market that's evolving out here. And so they need to be good at hyping and telling and guessing, et cetera, like that, because we're talking about organizational utilization. See, the end user organizations have just not been proactive at all about being in this, about what could they do if, and how would they employ it, and what do they need, and what are the standards and stuff that they need. So they're sort of passively being led around, and that's just not going to do them. The big example I point to is, hey, the computer world ignored the network. All this network stuff started in 1970. So say it was early 80s it was really working. But it wasn't until in 90-something 3 or something like that that they got where you couldn't tell them that that was going to be critically important. Sun Microsystems said, hey, the network is the computer. But it just wasn't there, and yet that's such a tremendously important thing to the end user organization. So just as examples, unless end user organizations get proactive about starting to explore for themselves conceptually, et cetera, what's here, and funding some things that get prototypes out there that, like the frontier out there, is saying, we need to think of outposts out in that frontier that help us know what's there. Because otherwise, Proctor Gamble, as progressive it might be, goes wandering out on here and falls off a cliff or gets mired in a swamp. So
this is a very challenging area. I go, for example, to Microsoft every 6 months for a global executive roundtable, and because of the nature of the churn of the technology and the pace with which it is moving and the competitive focus and all, the end users who buy all this stuff are really the tail on the dog. And it's very difficult to get any insight, in my view, that's very meaningful going on the right side of the axis, the things that are coming in 3 to 5 years, even 1 to 2 years, like NT50. Where is it? And that's kind of like right here, but further out, it's very, very difficult. Now, I don't know whether it's because they don't know or they're afraid to talk about it, but it makes it very hard for companies. I mean, we, as industry, have invested $1 trillion in information technology, most of which will be obsolete very shortly. And that's not a good deal. I mean, we have to have it, we have to use it. But I'd be interested in taking this subject area and coming back to IT organizations for a minute, given the reality of the way the world is working today, where we really are being swept along by the tide of technology and technology companies. What would an intelligent IT organization look like to you for a company like Procter & Gamble? How should we be organized? What should we be thinking about in this whole area? And if you were a CIO, what would you do?
Well, first I'd have to go to school and learn how to be a CIO.
There isn't one.
No, but no. See, one of the real problems for me is if you're an outsider because you're not saying things that people can hear and grok into their world. If you persist in staying there because you think it's important, you're not getting the experience that it would take to know how inside an organization what you have to do. So I can be, but so in the concepts and the needs, I feel very confident about the general structure of all of this. But coming and saying, hey, I think the CIOs, you got to get into a community of CIOs and start helping yourselves work out what are the pictures. And I can give a lot of sort of what ifs and go find other people that can add things to it, but I don't think there's anybody right now that what's that frontier mean to CIOs? Human resources, another hugely. They just have to cooperate. Human resources, I guess, or whoever's responsible for, hey, how to help map the new kind of roles and organizational structure and the new kind of skills that you're going to take for granted that people are going to have in order to live in this new way. Okay, they're all very important things in that dimension. So it's the cooperation.
Fair enough, fair enough. You might be interested to know, Doug, I don't think we've shared this. We have an active project right now in the company being led by our chairman and by our president, Dirk Yager and John Pepper. It's called the Year 2005 Project, but it's basically aimed at the very types of things you're talking about. What are the things we're going to need to do in the future to be successful, with an important element on the human dimension as well as the empirical dimensions, not just IT, but a lot of other things, R&D as well. So we are starting to address this in a much more thoughtful, planful, comprehensive way, and hopefully not an insular way. We're bringing another company who's had a lot of experience helping companies go through this process of trying to figure out what's the world going to be like, what are the scenarios out there, and then how do you organize against those today. Other questions, comments, issues for Doug? Yeah, it's hard for me to see who's out there. Please, go ahead.
Question about what kind of staffing, given a company of 100,000 people, what would you think would be right in terms of the amount of staffing put against new frontier activities? Can you give us a feel? I mean, should a company like Proctor Gamble have a quarter of its people focused on that kind of thing?
See, I don't know enough about the business operation to know, and it's the kind of thing that I think progressive companies need to get together and try to start working on themselves. That's all the kind of C-level stuff in there. And I just know that what's there now isn't going to be able to handle the rate of change that's coming about. And so in trying to get this MetaNIC stuff going in the next, the CIOs just need to combine, or so does the human resources, or the combined, and collectively start doing that. And scenario development is, you just got to have a lot of that going on. And one of the real questions is this an infrastructure? Can the current kind of infrastructure, a lot of times you outsource to consultants, something like that, to do your B and maybe C. Where do they get it? See, this advanced scene, and then they get proprietary about the approach that they start selling instead of sharing out there like that. So it just seemed to me that the kind of end-user organizations involved in these cooperative stuff, and they could collectively fund somebody to do studies and scenarios, but they're plugged into the whole community's knowledge base and stuff like that.
Okay, other questions in the back? I really can't see that far. Please.
Your graph on the screen here, I think, reflects a challenge that P&G is facing today, which is an effort on the bottom to continue to take advantage of standardization of tools and gain greater benefits by doing that. But inherently, the people are different everywhere we apply those tools, and so the human aspect limits the effect of these global applications that we try to create. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how we take advantage of global opportunities of simplification without losing the inherent creativity and innovation that comes from the individual humans that we have.
That's one of the primary challenges, is integrating the individual contributions in so that the combined whole is more effective. And I can just say, I don't have any real answers, that they need to get in and experiment, but there are some of these futuristic things that you pretty sure will happen, and one of them is, because people can work from a distance collectively a lot more effectively, is just a premise that's sure to happen. Then you say, well, one of the things that will come about that is the kind of special knowledge and capability that individuals develop could be sold. You could be integrated through a wider range of activities. So where it used to be you'd have to be co-located in order to be part of a team, then you couldn't afford to have a specialist in there who would only be useful for 1 week out of the 3 months period or something. But with this new kind of way of collective working, you can bring people in for 6 hours or 2 hours or 10 days from any place in the world. So that for individuals that they could start becoming much deeper specialized people and still be sellable. But then you realize that some way about integrating the body of knowledge that's there, you're going to have people who specialty goes across here, up and down here, this way, like that. It's going to be very important in the way to find a way to integrate rapidly what's going on, that implicit experiential knowledge that somebody who's a specialist across tracks does. So the ability for then much more refined, deep specialties of various kinds, it's going to be a new kind of marketplace for people and for the way organizations work. But did that come anywhere near meeting your question?
Sure. Sure.
I think the real challenge for P&G specifically is to understand, as we try and develop technology solutions for a global organization, that global organization is made up of many smaller organizations that have very different needs. When do we start to have diminishing returns on our efforts to be global versus trying to meet those individual needs? And more importantly, how do we discover the balance?
Well, you know, and the engineer would say, well, there just have to be a bunch more built and start learning what they work. And the business about how long do you keep trying to be global if it's starting to make the different components get in trouble is that's one of the things about the interoperability and things like that, is that's a very basic out there in society problem, that in the end they're going to be integrated into a global capability. See, the whole connection like that. And so somehow if there are barriers to that, you know, quietly and respectfully for what people need to, you know, as humans need to be done with, that's just one of the problems, and knowing how far to go is trying to appreciate that you may get into what looks like booby traps then, that, my God, am I going to have to fire everybody over 50? Because their skills are out of date now. And he says,
That assumes we can't learn new ones, Doug. I would just say on the Procter & Gamble specific implications of that question, my own view would be that we have so far to go to milk the benefits, not milk, but gain the benefits of globalizing our worldwide operations, including our systems and our global intranets and all, that we're going to press forward very aggressively toward that and look for the offsets and the balances to make sure we don't standardize to a point where we fail to keep the innovative and entrepreneurial capabilities and the variety of things we need as a global company to be successful. But I would say, in our view, in the top of the company at least, that I would say 80 to 85% of what we're trying to do is take advantage of our scale through getting rid of our default to difference culture to a default to convergence culture and get the benefits out of that, which I don't think we're yet 10% of the way toward really achieving, even though we've done a lot. There's so much more ahead of us. We have about 5 more minutes here, so anybody's got questions, wave. Robert?
I've got a question on information overload. If you think about today and the amount of information that's available to us, the human mind can only take in so much and then retain so much. And we all are faced with information overload. And as I think about your comment about 30 years from now, being able to hold in the palm of your hand the equivalent computing capability that exists in the world today. My question to you is, how do you envision IT, information technology, helping with the whole dilemma of information overload?
Well, it provides the facilities by which you can experiment with how humans, with whatever you learn about their capabilities and tolerances and capacities, how they can integrate their respective capabilities into a collective group. And obviously won't be functionally effective if the individuals are subject to just total overload. So there's some question about how much more can they manage if they have the right kind of skills and training and tools, as well as the conventions by which the organization's knowledge is organized, etc. But still, you just say, okay, that become the roles. The people have to have roles in which they're not exposed to over like that. And then you say, how are we going to do that? Well, the technology guys say we've got things to offer. You know, we've got this emergence now of what they call intelligent agents, and it's a little different from what the artificial intelligence people in the past used to do, but it harnesses some of their things. But anyway, those can help be sort of support capabilities for people, so they can take off some of the kind of shock of what's going on there. But anyway, it's just something to learn and work out.
In a sense, we're in the middle of this now, if you think about it. I mean, 25 years ago, all the computing power in the world you could probably put on your PC today. So the next 25 years is really just an extension of that. Okay, I guess, Ted, you might be the last one.
Okay. Seems like you spent most of your life pretty far out front of the world as an innovator. And you know, and that you were rebuffed very often by the establishment or by the people who were dealing with today's problems. Assuming that's reasonably true, what would you say to a bunch of the establishment here about, what advice would you give them about how to treat their innovators and to treat people like you were?
Great question. And Doug, we only have 3 minutes for this answer. So you get this down to a 60-second commercial. You can think like a Proctor Gamble person here.
Well, that comes back to the what's the prevailing paradigms out there, and so society is going to be beset by people that are waving their arms and talking about things that other people can't understand, and if they'd only turn it into my language and explain it, so it's their fault. So, you know, I recognize that there's that problem, and I don't know any answer to it, other than that society needs to start adapting its paradigms to fit the times, because if the paradigms that are operative aren't up to date, then there'll be people that don't deserve to be pushed under that do, or something like that. So anyway, it's just, this is one of the things that we talk about, infrastructure that can help sort of shape and adapt and try to help move the paradigm evolution fast enough. That's all I can just say, because, you know, I can't blame people for, you know, shunting me off in those days. It was just, that was prevailing paradigm. There was no way to give them the experiences that would help shape.
I would build just 2 other points on top of that. One would be that management, whomever they may be, needs to listen better and be willing to experiment more and not take anything for granted, but go out and try and learn through some empirical experiences about the most extreme ideas, even though they might not seem as though they're in the world of the possible with today's paradigm. Well, I would like to thank Doug and Christina for joining us today. I think it's very, very evident that we have a person here who 30, 40 years ago was thinking as far into the future as to be able to see what we're seeing today, and continues to do that, as he has demonstrated with his traipsing around the conceptual model of the bootstrap idea into the next 30, 40 years. And I think it's truly remarkable, and we're truly honored to have you here, and thank you very much for coming.
Don't go away. Christina said, let's give a gift to Todd. So we have a gift that she made us late this morning by getting it wrapped.
It's a... Go ahead.
No, I'd love to hear what your thought about right away.
No, I just realized I was about to put my foot in my mouth, so I better shut up.
No, well, I was given an award for the World Wide Web conference a couple of years ago, and what the guy who put this up to generate that, he got in touch secretly with Christina, and so they got together some of the things we'd published in the past and condensed them into a little booklet, and they produced a limited published bound thing that are signed by both me and Tim Berners-Lee, and like that. So here's one just for you.
Oh, thank you. That's
because meeting him was great, and the things I've learned today about your organization, you really are doing better than anybody we've met. So, but don't let it go to your head. But anyway, so we appreciate very much the exposure here. So.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.